The primary purpose of Uniquely Human, the podcast, is to educate and inform. The views expressed during all episodes are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute educational or medical advice. Listeners should consult with professionals familiar with each individual or family for specific guidance.
Uniquely Human, the podcast, is produced by Elevated Studio. Music is graciously provided by Matt Savage of Savage Records.
Hi, I'm Dr. Barry Prezant, clinical scholar, researcher, and consultant on autism and neurodiversity, and a Brooklyn boy raised in the big city.
And I'm Dave. I'm none of those things, and I grew up on a farm in Illinois. But being on the spectrum myself, I have plenty of personal insight to lend.
And this is Uniquely Human, the podcast, a show that illuminates and celebrates autism and neurodiversity.
Well, Barry, this is an exciting episode. This is a day where we get to spend some time with somebody that I've been following for a while. And even though I'm not in the SLP world, I married into it. So I've always keep my eyes open for new ideas and fresh thinking and people who I think are absolutely doing the right thing. And that's who we have today. So I'll let you tee it up for us.
Sure. We're so pleased to have Rachel Nadel on today. Rachel and I go back a little bit in that I was a guest on her podcast, which we'll be talking about. So, Rachel, welcome to Uniquely Human, the podcast.
Thank you guys so much. I am such a big fan of this podcast. So I'm like fangirling a little bit that I'm actually going to be on it.
It's likewise.
Now you're going to have to be guest girling a little bit, so because we're so pleased to have you on. So just a little bit about your background. Rachel is an LA-based speech-language pathologist dedicated to coaching parents and professionals on incorporating technology to best support speech and language development. And boy, what an area of explosion in our field, because of course, Rachel and I are of the same tribe. Rachel presents both nationally and abroad on the use of augmentative alternative communication, and also coaches parents, clinicians, and teachers on integrating assistive technology in classrooms and at home, very important, cross environments, to support communication. She co-hosts a weekly podcast called Talking with Tech and creates educational resources, therapy materials, and courses to help support parents and professionals. And Rachel, your work has been featured in a lot of places, in International Society for Augmentative and Alternative Communication, or ISAC, the United States Society for Augmentative and Alternative Communication, Autism Parenting Magazine, The Sensational Brain, that caught my attention, and Closing the Gap. So we always, and our listeners are always interested in the journey of our guests. So if you could tell us a little bit about your journey, how you became a speech-language pathologist, and then how you came to focus on AAC.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I actually have a background in journalism. And I thought I was going to be on a career trajectory living in New York City, working for a magazine. And I had a experience with a little boy that completely shifted everything for me. Long story short, I saw a little boy that was being bullied. And afterwards, I saw it, witnessed it, got kind of like a mama bear. Don't, say that to him. And I was at the time very, passive. I wasn't very assertive. And afterwards, the mom came up to me. She had her son and she said, he's been being bullied. And I just really appreciate what you did for him. And I had this moment where I just was super drawn to him and I wanted to talk to him and I wanted to play with him. And I remember running upstairs after that interaction and searching frantically, like special needs teacher. Like I started doing all this research because I knew in that moment that I wanted to work with kids with disabilities. And I applied to grad school on a whim. I actually got I got a letter from the one school that I applied to, which was Temple. That was where I did my undergrad. And then I applied to one graduate program. And I remember my mom actually got the letter And she's like, oh, honey, you got on the wait list. And I'm like, it's fine, Mom. I'll just be a journalist. Like, I already had jobs, like editorial assistant jobs lined up. And she actually forged my signature, sent it back in. And then a week later, I got an acceptance letter. And so I, did my master's. I like thanked my mom for being like the person who, signed that letter for me, because at that point, I just figured it was such a long shot because I had a degree in journalism. I didn't have a background in speech, language, and hearing. And it was just such a pivotal moment. And as soon as I started my graduate coursework, I just loved it. And I was like, I've always loved kids. And so it just felt like a perfect fit career-wise.
Yeah.
Fantastic
Isn't that amazing?
story.
How one little boy, isn't that amazing? Kind of shifted your whole life and your whole purpose in life. That's wonderful.
Yes.
All righty. Well, when we come to talk about AAC, there seems to be, in some cases, different opinions, even about the definition of AAC. So how do you define AAC, augmentative and alternative communication, and some of the misconceptions about what it is?
Yeah. So it's essentially any type of tool or support, because it can be paper-based. It also could be, what most people think of with AAC, which is a speech generating device, something that's high tech. But it really is anything that can help augment communication, or for individuals that are non-speaking, it could be an alternative means of communication. And so it's a huge kind of umbrella term, and a lot of different things fall under it. I think the important thing for people to understand is that they're not all created equal. And so a lot of what I do in my work is advocating for robust AAC. So you could have something like, a choice board with a child's favorite snacks on it. Technically, that's AAC. But we want to make sure when we're thinking through the lens of AAC, we're thinking long term. Like, what is this child eventually going to need in order to fully access communication the same way that speakers do? And so it's something that I'm really passionate about. And I'm often advocating for that, in the work that I do, because I've seen a lot of situations in my career where there's some potential gatekeeping of robust high-tech AAC. There's some limiting beliefs like, oh, that's too complex, or they're too young. And, these are all kind of myths around the work that I do. And I've seen such incredible progress with individuals where we put the right tool in front of them, a tool that has access to lots of words and grammar and a keyboard, and amazing things can happen when you have the right tool.
Absolutely. And by the way, like this AAC, it's so funny. Like, this is not something that's just relegated to the demographic that this show really is driven towards. Like, I'll put it this way. I work for an Italian company, a French and Italian company that merged. And so much of the conversation that occurs when you're meeting someone face to face in the Italian offices, and our listeners won't be able to see this, but a lot of it is hand gestures,
yes,
face gestures, not a word being, uttered, spoken, but certainly the message is conveyed. And then anytime I have any kind of support issue, of course, raise a ticket in the chat window, right? So I'm typing my ideas. They're typing the responses back to me. So this is happening in all areas. And the difference being, of course, this is the primary way that somebody would be communicating. So, of course, we want to respect that.
Yeah. Which is such a great point, Dave, because this idea of multimodal communication, as you mentioned, it's everywhere. We're all sending, a GIF to a friend to communicate something, right? Like, we all are using different forms of AAC, and it's important that we really support that multimodal communication, because there's lots of ways that individuals are communicating. And especially, the kids that I work with who, are really good candidates or using AAC, they are communicating with gestural communication and lots of, verbal approximation sometimes. And so it's like really thinking through the lens of how can we honor whatever way an individual decides to communicate.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know the source of this, but I know it's been said many times that 70% of communication is not through speech, is nonverbal communication. And we're more likely to kind of decode a message by watching a person's gestures and face. For example, if they're saying something that they don't believe in, or they're contradicting what they're actually saying in words, you could see that. You could see that in there. And we go to the nonverbal. And we say, well, you say you're happy, but my goodness, you look like you're despondent right now.
So true.
Yeah. And specifically when we get to parents and supporting parents, because we all do this and we all put that as a priority. A logical assumption that many parents make, and I think we have to understand it is a logical assumption, that if you're working with my child on whatever it might be, sign language, a picture board, speech generating device, won't my child become too reliant on that because it's easier? So, and especially because some parents believe that speech, the way I like to put it, is speech is the promised land. Once the child speaks, everything is taken care of, right?
So true.
So how do you respond to that when parents says, will AAC prevent my child from speaking?
Yeah, it's such a common misconception. And to your point, Barry, it is so intuitive in some ways. Like, well, if they're not focusing on practicing with verbal speech, then of course they're going to just, rely on the device. That's what I hear a lot. It's like, I don't want them to become too reliant. And, my response to that is children will choose the path of least resistance. And in whatever moment they're in, if they find it easier to use an AAC system, that's what I want them to do. And I work with individuals that have inconsistent access to verbal speech. So, it's not just individuals that are completely non-speaking. It's also individuals that have some verbal speech. But after talking to lots of autistic adults who are part-time AAC users, I've learned that it doesn't mean that access is always there. And so it's really important to give alternative access to individuals. And the idea that verbal speech won't come is very common, especially with younger children. Parents of younger children have that concern. And we actually have some really great research from Connie Kazari out of UCLA, which basically found speech generating devices can increase verbal speech, which was such a huge win for our field, because that's definitely what I see clinically. Really, any means of communication is what I'm trying to support with the individuals that I work with. I'm not prioritizing one over the other. I'm trying to allow the individual to understand what options are available for them, and then they get to choose in that moment what works best for them.
And that also is at least for me, it points out a fact that for so many years, we didn't consider the whole issue of dysregulation and how being physiologically or emotionally dysregulated impacts everything. Yes. As a matter of fact, we just had Terry Duncan on, who just published a book that emotion regulation is everything. But finally, what you're saying is, wait a second, there are factors that even when a person is well regulated, and can use speech as a primary mode of sharing information or intentions, that if you factor in dysregulation, boom, what goes first? Very often it's speech.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know you guys have had Chloe Rothschild on, and
yes,
she also came on my podcast. And one of the things that really stood out to me was she was talking about how during board meetings, she was not able to communicate at the level of sophistication that she was really trying to achieve with verbal speech. And so she would oftentimes use AAC in those moments. And I was just like, wow, like this is amazing that I'm understanding so much better, the nuances of this, because it's not always black and white. Like we always try to put everything in boxes, but it's just so nuanced. And again, the ease at which we have access to technology now is so great. And so, if we can help support individuals with communication in whatever way that looks like, that's ultimately my goal.
And I love how I love the language that you're using, because just even in the first 5 minutes of us talking about this, what you've been saying consistently is help individuals. So we're not talking about, hey, we've determined that AAC is one size fits all for everybody, so go off and use it and you should become totally addicted and reliant and blah, blah, blah. We're saying you'll find right away whether or not this is a worthy supplemental tool for communication. And if it is, lean into it. And if it's not, keep working.
The other thing I'll say is AAC is actually pretty hard. Like, it's hard to create long sentences on AAC. And so if it becomes easier to speak it, guess what? Like, they will speak it. And I like to share that too, because it's like, oh, well, they just will rely on this device. I'm like, building messages on an AAC device is not fast and easy. And so the moment that verbal speech is easy to access or becomes easier, that's what the individual will use. And so I like to share that, because I feel like it's like this preconception that AAC, it's just, so easy and we just put it in front of them. Like, no, it's actually pretty hard to create messages using a speech generating device. It takes time. And so, again, individuals will choose what's easiest for them in that moment. And as an SLP, that's really my job, is to help support individuals communicating in whatever modality they feel most comfortable in.
And I think a lot of people also miss the point that language is not what comes out of your mouth. It is speech.
Yes.
And so when you are using AAC, as you mentioned, if you are building more complex utterances on a device, which may not be so easy to do, you really are building the child's internal language system, both receptively and expressively. But I think a lot of people miss that point, that language is kind of a cognitive social structure in our mind. Chomsky taught us that years ago. And that we're not just focusing on the speech, we're still building a child's internal language system. But in this case, we're not using an auditory-based speech system. We're using visually based in many cases.
Yeah. And that visual component is so powerful for individuals. Speech is fleeting. It's ephemeral. It's like, I say it, and if you didn't catch it, then it's gone. And so one of the great things about AAC is that it slows down the process. And all of a sudden I have a message window and I can refer back to the message that I'm creating. And it just helps really support individuals that, might not have the working memory skills to hold on to information as they're generating a message and formulating. And so I like the visual supports that it provides can be really powerful.
Yeah. Speech evaporates.
I love that.
It's here and then it's gone. So now sometimes we hear, and I know you've heard it quite a bit, that either parents or professionals, and it may not be just parents, who say, okay, yeah, we've tried AAC, we tried that low-tech picture symbol board, or, we tried Prolo Quota Go with, an iPad. It just doesn't work. And I think you partially answered the question, but if you could expand upon that a little bit, it's not so easy all the time, right?
Absolutely. I'd say many of the families that come to see me in my practice, they have tried AAC. It's like, it's not their first rodeo. And, I'll have an initial call and I'll start asking questions. And, there's always this kind of discouragement around it. And, the biggest questions that I have is, one, how was it introduced? Because we know that children who are learning language need to have very clear motivations to communicate something. And oftentimes what I see, unfortunately, is, AAC is being introduced in, a classroom setting. And there's this huge emphasis on academics, which at some level I understand, because in school, we have a curriculum and we're, thinking through the lens of academics. However, when we're thinking about an emergent communicator, we have to find the most motivating thing to see what the true potential is for the use of the technology. And I always share the story with like looking at a report, because oftentimes I see families after they've been through the school system and, they've basically been denied access to AAC, saying, the child's not ready, putting that in air quotes. And so I'll read through this report and I'm like looking and I'm really analyzing how was this introduced? And I'm reading things like, during the art activity, they weren't able to request the color marker. And I'm thinking like, did the child care about the color marker? It's like my first question is like, unless they love the color purple, like, why are we using that as the litmus test to, gauge a child's potential for using this type of technology? So it's something that's really important is like, how was it introduced and how many demands were placed upon it? Because that's another huge problem, unfortunately, is that we put this device in front of a child and then we have all these expectations around how a child's, supposed to use it. And we expect it to be immediate, which, is not giving our students any type of patience and grace. Babies spend the first year of their life just, absorbing, babbling, exploring before they talk. And so it's like the same thing needs to happen with an individual that hasn't had access to any of that exploration, any of that babbling. And so, I think that ultimately just really figuring out ways to make sure that I'm focusing on the most motivating things for this individual that's in front of me and that I'm not putting too much pressure on the situation, modeling without expectation, inviting communication instead of asking lots of questions and putting a lot of kind of pressure, that can very easily make a student not want to use a AAC system. And, we have to be really careful about all the demands that we're placing around an individual and expectations because our students feel that. They feel when there's an expectation, even worse when, a child tries to communicate something on an AAC system and then, they're met with try again, and it's just like, there's nothing that like makes me more frustrated than hearing that because, we are working with children that have very limited communication. Oftentimes they're being brave enough to try to say something and then they're met with, that was wrong.
Yeah.
And so like we're surprised why they don't want to communicate with us, like why they're not using this system. So again, it's very nuanced, but like the way we introduce AAC really does matter.
You're making such a good point about how they're met with their first interaction with it. Because like my wife, Kristen, and I, who, by the way, is an SLP, and our very first travel date together as a couple when we were dating, she wanted to go. She was going to AAC in the mountains. It was an AAC conference way back in like 2002 or something in Salt Lake City. So our romance started with AAC, so I'm a big fan of AAC. But
I love it.
I went hiking and she sat in conference rooms for like 3 days, and it was fantastic. If we are going to introduce something as important as a supplemental communication method, tool, framework, anything, let's set everyone up for success here. Not just the user, but the people around the user, and so that their very first interaction with this thing isn't, oh, this is impossible, or, oh, great, even the machine doesn't think that I'm saying the right thing. Fantastic.
Yeah.
It also begs the question of an environment that is immersed in AAC. We never say about a 6-month-old, well, we never talk to the 6-month-old because she's not ready to speak. It's kind of like, we immerse a child in how we use language. One other point I just wanted to make, it's so important to understand that what we're after is helping a child with self-expression, with expressing their intentions. And Rachel, you expressed so clearly and so beautifully how so often AAC is not presented that way. It's presented like, give me the right answer or point to, which gets into the whole compliance issue as opposed to initiation. So what do you see as, how we can help parents to understand that piece, that AAC isn't like learning to point to pictures when you say the picture, or my child must be able to point to a picture of cookie before they can request cookie?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm really working alongside of families to help them understand the importance of naturalistic opportunities, because I feel like, especially families that have been in the therapy game for a while, they're kind of conditioned to believe that I need to sit across the table from my child and I need to practice communication, which I'm not saying there aren't elements that like we're skills and strategies that we're practicing. However, it needs to be integrated into your everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of what I do in my own clinical work is coaching. And so I am not working directly with children. I'm working directly with communication partners that are interfacing the most with a child. And I think that, part of it is just one, finding the right routines. So often we hear about routines-based intervention, and, I'm thinking through more of the early intervention lens, but we kind of think we put that lens on AAC, and I'm like, well, yes, we need to embed it into routines, but it has to be the right routines, because if a child doesn't like getting dressed in the morning, that's not the moment you want to pull off the AAC device and start, saying, put on shirt, put on, pants. It's like, that's not the move, right? Not to say you can't be modeling language throughout a day, but the reality is it's modeling on AAC is a skill that takes practice, and it's also not super intuitive. And so I like to work with families on finding the right types of routines. One question I love to ask is, what's your favorite time of day with your child? Because that's the moment that I want to support. It's like, oh, well, we always watch TV after dinner. It's like, well, that's the moment then. Like, that's the moment where, you guys are both feeling joy, and I can help support the connection between you two. And so, I think it's really getting clear on what routines that you're integrating into. And then, the communication partner training is really about understanding what a child's intrinsic motivation is in that moment. So another question I like to ask is, if your child had access to all the words right now, what would they be saying? And that shifts families, communication partners into thinking, like, what would they say? I love sharing the story of a mom. She was like the mom of a teenage boy. I was doing parent coaching with her, and she, shares this video with me, and she's walking into her son's room in the morning, modeling, good morning, like, how are you? She's like this, like, budding ray of sunshine. And I'm watching this interaction, and I'm like, pause the video, and I'm like, what do you think he would say right now if he could say anything? And she thinks about it, and she's like, he'd probably tell me to get out. And I'm like, yeah, I think so. Like, he's like, he wants to sleep. Like, he doesn't want to say good morning to his mom. He's a teenage boy. And so, we start modeling that, like, literally within a day. She said that he would hear her start walking towards the room, and he would get his AAC and start saying, get out, get out.
That's
so it's
awesome.
like a perfect example of how, like, we think we know, what an individual could say in a situation, but it really has to match the intention of the individual. And I love that question, because I really think it gets to the heart of what would this person want to communicate in this moment.
I mean, you just gave a wonderful description of self-determination. Okay, this is who I am. This is how I'm feeling at this point in time. So important. But you also raised prior to that a very important point of the shared positive emotion and the shared positive experience. From outside of our fields, years ago, Stanley Greenspan spoke about that if we create that shared positive emotion, that it's kind of, reinforcing. I hesitate using that word a little bit, as some people might think of it, but in the sense of it makes you feel good as a partner, and it makes the child or the person you're with feel good, which creates that reciprocity. You want to keep it going. You want to keep it moving along, because your mind, your brain, and your body is saying this feels good, this positive energy.
Absolutely. And, I think that so often I do a lot of work watching other people and, like, helping to coach them. And a lot of times what I'm seeing in classrooms, and I'm just like, these kids are so bored. Like, we're having them talk about the things that are the most boring things. Like in Southern California, we don't need to tell, everybody it's sunny every day. Like we get it, like let's like move to something that's interesting. So I love using GIFs in therapy. And I'm like, teaching a teacher, like, look, like if we want to talk about the sun, like or rain, let's pull up something funny that gets kids like excited to communicate about something. All of us have to be motivated to communicate, and we're not running into our office being like, the car was driving. Guess what? I saw a car driving on my way in. It's like, that's boring, but we're like having kids build sentences that are like, the cat is orange. I'm like, who cares? Like, maybe this kid does care about cats and the fact that the cat's orange, but most often I'm like, let's find things that are actually motivating for kids and that sparks communication. Because to your point, Barry, it should be a free flowing exchange, and it should be, a way to connect. And so it's so important that we choose the right types of activities and language to really have that free flow exchange.
Rachel, what would be your expectation then for the communication partner integrating the AAC, whether it's technology or opposite of technology? Like, what would be your expectation for that communication partner using it in their daily life as a modeling thing? Is that realistic, and is that helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we know about AAC, is that that's how children learn to use AAC. You have to speak AAC to a child in order for them to learn it. It is like another language that you have to kind of think through that lens, and you have to be immersed in that language. And, it's even as nuanced as I was working with a family, and I was doing parent coaching with mom, and one day, mom couldn't come to a session. So I had a session with dad, and dad's like, he never uses it with me. And my first question is, do you use it with him? Like, are you modeling with him? And of course he's like, well, no. And so, we go through a kind of a coaching experience, and I get clear. I'm like, what's a really great routine? This student loves the hot tub. And so I'm like, how does he tell you he wants to go to the hot tub? He brings his bathing suit. I'm like, okay. So we set up this like awesome routine where, dad is modeling hot tub when his son comes and brings him this swimsuit. And, he comes back next week to the session with me almost in tears, because he said as soon as he had the AAC system out and he modeled hot tub, his son looked at him like, oh my gosh, you're speaking my language. And he came right up, said hot tub. He said the rest of the week he was saying hot tub, hot tub, hot tub. And it's like, I love that story because it just shows, this child's had AAC for years. But if you don't model on it, then a child doesn't know that that's a way that you guys can communicate with each other. And so it really is important to make sure the communication partners around a child are modeling language, so that kids can be immersed in it, and also they feel confident to communicate back.
Fantastic.
It really demonstrates how much we have to be close observers, because what we model might also be what we're reading into the child's intentions.
Yeah.
We'd like to take a moment to thank you for listening to Uniquely Human, the podcast. It is so gratifying to hear that so many of you find value in what we share.
It is gratifying, and it's so much fun making this show together, Barry. Being able to meet with you every week and all the guests and listener support that we've received, it's such a joy to make this show. And of course, we are commercial free, but Barry and I would invite you to support this show in a number of different ways. That could be buying our books, or even inviting us to speak live or virtually to your organization or to your community. To learn more about all of this, you can, of course, go to our websites, barrypresent.com or davidjfinch.com, to learn more about our speaking topics and how to work with us and all of the consultative services that we provide.
And we also want to know how we're doing. We are in a constant quality improvement mode here.
Yes.
So please make sure to leave comments and ratings, suggestions on social media. Contact us directly on the links on our website, and recommend Uniquely Human, the podcast, to those in your lives. In conclusion, we are so grateful to you, our Uniquely Human community, for your support and loyalty, and we'll be keeping at it.
Yes, thank you all so much. Now back to the show.
So I wanted to just share a quick story. This goes back a number of years. I was observing a child in a behavioral program that was following a particular protocol for teaching language. And it was discrete trial based. So a child sits down, a stimulus is presented, how many trials before the child gets a break, on and on. And the room was close to a parking lot, and there was a big truck outside. It might have been a garbage truck. And this youngster loved trucks. Mm-hmm. And the child had some emerging speech, but still used gestures and vocalizations to express intentions. He ran over to the window when he heard the truck and went, yeah, yeah, yeah. And the response was, no, we have to sit down and finish our work. And the work was supposed to be working on language. And it's like, okay, I think we're missing the point here. Whose agenda is this anyway? You know?
It's such a good story. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a shame when those things happen. Now let's flip to the other side. I had one other point I wanted to make, actually. I just love the way you use the term coaching. Too often we hear, well, I do parent training. And that pretty much means I'm going to teach you what's my agenda, how you should behave or act. So I'm just going to throw this in there. How do you see coaching different than the term that's often used when people say parent training?
Yeah, I love this question because, to your point, so often in the AAC world, we have a lot of people doing trainings on AAC, which is, I'm going to tell you exactly what to do, but we don't have a lot of practitioners that are actually coaching, asking the reflective questions, helping to guide a communication partner, to evolve their skills. And sometimes when I'm working with an individual, there might be some moments where I do have to teach about, pausing longer and asking less questions. And there's some kind of skill sets that I need to teach. However, I really want to then shift to help a communication partner better understand how they're showing up. I use video modeling actually as a way to coach, and it's the best way to become a better communication partner. Even for myself, like I'll record, sessions for courses that I'm doing or, social media, and I have to watch myself back. And even to this day, I'm like, wow, like I didn't pause long enough there. Like, oh man, like I actually asked too many questions. And so it's this constant practice of being, the best possible communication partner that you could be for an individual. And, it's really important that as a practitioner, I'm really helping develop the thinking skills around an interaction for a communication partner to be successl. And it doesn't work when I just tell people what to do all day long. It doesn't stick, doesn't land. And what's so cool is that you can see throughout a coaching process, a communication partner start to understand. They're starting to recognize. I pause the video and I'm like, what do you think? And they're like, well, like I don't think he was actually really motivated by this. And so like, I probably should have, chose a different activity in that moment, or he said this and I totally missed it. It's like that reflective piece is so important to be better at what we do. I love the idea of using videos too, because if we think about professional athletes, how do they get better? They watch their tapes. Yes. Right? They record themselves and they watch their tapes back and they figure out how to do it better next time. Same thing with being, the best possible communication partner to an individual. It's like we need to recognize the ways that we're either supporting communication or sometimes not supporting it, so that we can, optimize and, really empower families, especially that they know what to do. You don't need, 5 times a week of speech therapy. I'm teaching you how to think like a speech language pathologist. It's really, that is an empowering thing for a family, because so often it's just like drop my kid off at therapy, might hear a little bit at the end of how they did. And then, we're leaving parents who are the primary communication partner for, their children. We're leaving them without the skills to actually implement these things and actually to help their child make progress.
I'm not going to get into the weeds on this, but I'm just smiling as you're speaking because centuries ago, when I did my doctoral dissertation, it was video analysis. Yeah. And some of the videos, not all, maybe about, I think, as I recall, about 20% of the videos that I used in my study, I was doing speech and language therapy with kids. Yeah. It was the greatest learning experience in the world. Exactly like you said. I had kids who were a little bit sensitive to getting into their physical space. And I'm seeing on the video, I leaned forward. And that's why David got up and ran to the other side of the room, just because I leaned forward 6 inches into his space. And then the things with parents, especially pointing out, because parents are always doing some things right, and they may not realize it. And you could point that out. You said, wow, you really shifted to what your child was attending to in the room at that point. And that's great. Look at how he responded. Well, she responded. Powerful.
Absolutely. And so often families and parents feel like they're not doing it right. They're not doing enough. They're not doing it right. And so, those moments where I can really call out all of the amazing things that I'm seeing are so powerful for communication partners. And it helps build that momentum. It's like, okay, I can do this. I can keep going. It's like it really is empowering to feel like you know what you're doing and to know that you're kind of evolving the skill set. And we have the opportunity as SLPs to really do that for families. I wish that we had more training in it in our graduate programming. It was something that I had to learn kind of ad hoc on my own. But, one thing that I say to clinicians who are trying to, go into more coaching is just ask more questions. That's it. Like focus on asking more questions and, leading with, what do you think about that? How do you think that went? Those are really simple ways to just kind of shift the dynamic from I'm just telling you what to do to, working together alongside of each other to help problem solve, troubleshoot, and to really evolve those skill sets.
And you're teaching parents to do something that we supposedly should see as the gold standard, and that's reflective practice. Think about what you're doing. Think about what's working. Change what you're doing based upon what you observe. And that's how we all grow and learn. It's just so important. So what are the misconceptions that we run into? And sometimes maybe either social media or mainstream media puts this misconception forward, and that is, if a child doesn't speak or speaks minimally, introduce AAC and it's going to be a miracle. It's going to be, oh my God, it's a miracle. And I know in one of the areas, and that has to do with spelling, a proponent who we've had on the podcast, Elizabeth Vossler, said, no, it's not a miracle. It's work. It's hard work, and especially hard work for the person you're supporting.
Totally.
And so how do you respond to that? Because we don't want to dampen enthusiasm. And we don't want to dampen hope, but sometimes it could be presented in a way that is not helpful.
Yeah, I always like to think about like the Dateline special, right? It's like there was a Dateline special and then like all of a sudden they were unlocked. And it's like, okay, like unfortunately, like I wish it were that easy. Like my job would be a lot simpler, right? So it's just like, I think, like you said, kind of leveling the playing field and setting clear expectations around what this is going to look like. Because it's a lot of work. It's, I think it comes down to the root cause oftentimes of why an individual would even need AAC. And that goes back to motor planning, right? So the motor planning for a speech generating device is also challenging for some individuals. The motor planning for spelling with letters is challenging for individuals. And so I think it's just really having families understand what this process is going to look like, but also reminding them that all of this extra work, because that's essentially what it is, right? I'm like, okay, like now you have to have this device and you have to figure out how to model on it all day long. It's all this extra work for a parent, for a teacher. However, that work is so worthwhile when you actually can understand an individual better. You can help that individual connect with the people around them, share, their internal world, because that's really what communication is. And so I think that, when I'm talking with a family, I'm trying to get really clear about what is it that you want to, hear your child communicate about. And so often it's like, I don't know when they're sick. I don't know, when something's wrong. And valid, so valid. Like that's so scary to imagine as a parent, not knowing when you send your child to school what's happened because they can't come home and, communicate that to you. And so I get really clear with families when I'm, starting off with them. really, what do you want to work on? Like, what are your goals? And really, revolving the work I do around that, alongside of the individual, goals that an individual has for themselves and what I'm kind of noticing. But I think that just really getting clear, and that helps, anchor into the why. Like, why are we doing this? Why are we, putting all this energy and effort in? It's like, because we want to give this gift of communication and connection. And I think that's why I get so angry when I see things like, colors and numbers and things like that. I'm like, I'm only interested in that if the child's interested in that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's where, really anchoring into things that are meaningful and relevant to an individual and their family. That's how I can kind of make the sell for the extra work.
Yes. You raised an important point when you referred briefly to teachers and other people who support a child. And I think one of the misconceptions also, understandably so, that parents might have is, well, all the other kids speak and my child's in an inclusive classroom, or even in a special classroom, if you will, for students who need extra support, where many of the students speak. Won't my child be seen or othered as an outsider? And I'm just curious, I certainly have had so many observations of kids using AAC in classrooms when the teacher modeled that and saw it as a part of communication. So what's your experience in terms of how other children respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have the responsibility as SLPs, especially, to try to create an environment of inclusion around AAC. And there's no better way than to have everybody communicating using AAC, right? So like, not only do I want the teacher to be modeling, but I also want peers to be modeling, and I want everybody to be speaking AAC. Same thing in a family dynamic, right? Like, sometimes my families will get a second, speech generating device for the family to model. And so they're all kind of speaking AAC. So it helps to, it helps a student not feel like they're different, not feel like, well, I have to communicate in this way and nobody else is doing that. And so I think the more we can create that kind of inclusive environment and promote peers, teachers, paraprofessionals, like, we all speak AAC, we all speak AAC in this family, all the siblings, everybody, right? It just helps to help a student feel included and to feel like, their form of communication is, different, but it's at the same level as everybody else because everybody else is speaking AAC.
And sometimes I think we see, maybe not quote unquote all the kids, but you have kids who are fascinated by it. And they want to learn how to use a device, and totally. And maybe those are the future people who will work to support kids, because they see kind of how it could really help a child benefit from having that AAC available.
Well, and also what helps, I say this all the time, but what helps the autistic individual, what helps the neurodivergent individual, helps everybody. So the children in the classroom who may not require this all the time, any kind of additional support of, communication methods, they'll find that, oh my gosh, I actually prefer this in this situation. And it benefits everyone.
Absolutely. The more inclusive practices that we have, the more, beneficial it is to everyone for a variety of reasons. And it's just like, kids learn way better from other kids than they do from adults. And so often the clients that I work with, they're so kind of therapyized. It's like, they're so, used to working alongside of adults and communicating to adults. And it's like, but like, they're interested in what their peers doing. Like, if their peer's the one that's modeling this, like, guess what? It's going to stick a lot faster. And so I'm a big proponent of having peers model language, having siblings, like really including kids in the mix, because again, like, kids learn way better from other kids than they do from adults.
Yes. Absolutely. I could even envision being somebody who has attended headphone parties where everybody's wearing noise canceling headphones and nobody's talking, and it's wonderful. I could envision hosting a birthday party where it's like, you come to the party, everybody uses speech synthesis device or something like that, just to celebrate the fact that, hey, we're all in this vibe together.
Mm-hmm.
I love it.
That's shared, yeah. So just to sum up here, what is 2 or 3 of the major benefits that you've observed, especially as you've followed children over a number of years?
I mean, I think the 2 biggest ones is less frustration, because now all of a sudden a individual has a more reliable means of communication, which not having that can cause a lot of frustration, and more connection. I mean, once you give the gift of communication to an individual, they're able to connect with the world around them. They're able to start sharing about all of the, things that are interesting to them and fascinating. And, those are 2 of the most amazing things, to help someone not feel so frustrated all the time and to be able to connect. And so, those are the most important things when we're thinking about just like our life in general, right? Like, we all want to connect with those around us. And of course, we don't want to feel frustrated. And I know that's a lot of times so powerful for the families that I work with. They, of course, want to have their child less frustrated, and they want to connect, because we all have that kind of intrinsic desire at some level to connect with the people around us that we love.
Yes, beautifully said. I mean, just the child saying, I'm Rachel, and I'm going to let you know what I think, what I love, what I do. And I'm putting it out to you because I have a way to let you know now. So, yeah.
Exactly.
Rachel, thank you so much for your energy, for all of the work you do in supporting kids, adults, and families. And look forward to connecting more in the future.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. What a pleasure it's been. And yeah, this has been great. Thank you again for thinking of me.
Enjoy the sunshine.
Yes. Thank you guys so much.
Yes.
Have a good rest of your day.
Okay.
Thanks,
you
Rachel.
too. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.